Can you keep up?
Rise and shine.
Welcome to Crazy Fun Park.
Just the people I want to see.
Who are you guys?
I'm Croc Warrior.
What do you think?
I love it. Interesting.
I want action, excitement, and aliens. Whoa. A real monster!
Let's keep it moving.
Seriously?
Okay, cut. Let's reset.
This community is expecting big things from you.
We'll do whatever it takes. You ready, my boy? Yeah! Yeah! Woo! Set sail!
Message received. I do need you. You know that, right? Damn straight.
I love it!
Up here, it's 100% adrenaline.
Who's up for it?
We're explorers. We'll scour the whole ocean if we have to. Uh-oh.
You don't get to do this every day.
It's pretty special, eh?
Yeah. We missed you.
These have only got each other, so stick together.
Oh, you beauty. It's our year. I can feel it.
Good.
Thank you. Is this on? Thank you so much for your wonderful introduction. And I'd like to acknowledge the distinguished guests who are present here today, especially the Minister for Culture. I think it's a very great achievement for the Foundation to actually have you present. And it inspires me to think that perhaps here in Taiwan, we're in a very special moment as far as children's television is concerned, and I think that's really wonderful. And I'd also like to thank the team, the whole team at the Fubon Cultural and Educational Foundation for your invitation to speak, but also your amazing welcome and hospitality. We've been having a really terrific time since we arrived, so thank you very much. In the English-speaking screen world, screen content is dominated by American culture, and to some extent British culture. And so it does surprise a lot of people that a country like Australia, with only 25 million, maybe nearly 26 million people, produces so much of its own children's content. The trailer that I just showed was the material that we've supported in the last 18 months. And today I've been asked to take you behind the scenes to explain why we place so much value on making our own locally produced content for children and how we made it happen. And to begin with, I'd like to ask you to reflect on the power of a story and perhaps to think about stories that have moved you over your life and that have stayed with you for your life. Can you remember the first time you saw a movie in a cinema? And do you remember what it was? Do you remember, did someone read to you when you were little? Or is there a favourite TV show from your childhood that everyone else your age also remembers? Because childhood is such a formative time in our lives, it's sometimes easier for us to remember those stories that we grew up with than the ones that we read or watched just last year. Childhood is such an important time in our lives. And stories are a fundamental part of the human experience. And humans have always told them. around campfires and on the walls of caves, in song and dance, in theatres, in books, at bedtime. They explain what we know and imagine what we don't. They entertain, they comfort, they encourage us to walk a mile in someone else's shoes and imagine what it's like to be them. They're unique to every culture, and stories are also universal. But we're now living in a fully fledged screen age, and film and television, these are the great storytelling mediums of our time. This is why it's so important. Can't work that, but now I can. This is why it's so important that we consider screen and storytelling. So when Australia got television for the first time in the 1950s, there were two types of broadcasting. We had a public broadcaster, the ABC, which was modelled on the BBC. The ABC imported nearly all of its content from Britain, and the announcers all spoke in very carefully cultivated British accents that would have sounded more at home in Buckingham Palace than Bondi Beach. And then we had that other type of television, commercial television, which was modelled on the US system. These privately owned channels funded by advertising imported almost all of their programs from the United States, and everybody watching those channels got to hear lots and lots of American accents. Being an English language country was both an advantage and a disadvantage. It meant it was very easy to import cheap shows from America and the UK, which was great news for people who run TV channels, but it meant that there weren't very many Australian TV shows on the television. The children of my generation grew up with the Brady Bunch, My Favourite Martian and I Dream of Jeannie all over the after-school television. But after a while, Australians started to think about the impact of television content all coming from the UK and the US. Australian books and stage plays and radio plays and art and music and comedy were all taking off and exploring themes that were uniquely relevant to us, where we were in our part of the world down under. So this encouraged people in the arts to push for Australian drama on TV. But because making local television content was much more expensive for the networks than buying Australian and British content, the television stations weren't interested. And for that reason, the government introduced Australian content quotas on commercial television networks. It required them to show minimum levels of Australian content. And it also started supporting an emerging Australian screen industry with direct investment in Australian film and television and tax incentives to encourage production of our own screen stories. But initially, the focus was entirely on developing shows for adults. The commercial broadcasters didn't like having to produce Australian content. They argued that this was inappropriate interference in their business and that they should be trusted to regulate themselves. So then in the 1970s, there was a big public inquiry about whether they really could self-regulate themselves. And a whole lot of people and organisations just came out of the woodwork to appear at that inquiry and say, not only could they not be trusted to screen Australian content without regulation, but they had a really special privilege being able to beam into everybody's lounge room for free, and for that reason, they should also be required to do children's content. So in 1979, which was the International Year of the Child, regulations were introduced that now required broadcasters to screen minimum levels of children's programs. But you know, Australia wasn't unique in doing this. Other countries introduced broadcasting codes for children's television around this time too. What was unique was the way in which we framed our standards. In France, they introduced requirements that programs aimed at children and adolescents should facilitate their entry into adult life. And in Canada, they had standards which said that programs for children should reflect the moral and ethical standards of contemporary Canadian society and encourage pro-social behaviour and attitudes. And in the United States, the Children's Television Act required that core children's programs must serve the educational and informational needs of children. These statements are all very proper, and it's hard to disagree with them. But imagine if we introduced standards like that for adult television. An equivalent standard for adult television might say that television series for adults should encourage them to be good citizens, pay their taxes, and drive within the speed limit. If it did, we might say goodbye to challenging, provocative, scary, entertaining, romantic, and funny shows. So in Australia, we did something a little bit different than the rest of the world. Our children's television standards said that children's programs should be child-specific, entertaining, and well-produced. That was it. In addition, broadcasters were required to transmit minimum levels of Australian children's drama, which was to take effect from 1984. And so those two things were truly unique at the time. The inclusion of the word entertaining and the requirement that broadcasters screen children's drama, which was the most expensive format to produce. But then the regulations were just step one. Step two was considering how children's television drama was going to be paid for. Because the broadcasters didn't like having those regulations, there was no way known they were going to spend the kind of money you need to spend to produce high-quality children's drama. So it was therefore possible the regulation would fail. Producers of drama were able to access funding that was already available for other screen content. However, when children's programs are competing for funding against prime-time adult shows, it's not always fair. Broadcasters will pay more, and investors, even government agencies, will invest more in prime-time content, leaving children's television with the little bit that's left. This makes it harder to produce children's shows with the ambition and the scale and the high production values that are required to make it truly successful. So for all these reasons, the Australian Children's Television Foundation, and I'm going to call us the ACTF from now on, was established to provide dedicated special funding and advocacy for Australian children's screen content, especially drama and scripted content. So at the ACTF, we invest in children's programs from beginning to end. We invest in script development, we executive produce and assist to finance the content that we really want to see happen. We invest in the production alongside other investors. We distribute programs internationally, and we develop educational resources to encourage our shows to be used in schools separately from their screening on television. We do everything that we can to ensure that we make it a success. So 40 years later, Australia is one of the most prolific producers of children's drama in the world, and Australian children's screen content is a deeply embedded feature in our culture. Indeed, most Australians below the age of 45 share fond memories of the Australian children's shows they grew up with. We broke new ground in the early days, introducing the world to a quirky Australian sense of humour with Round the Twist, which we eventually sold to almost every public broadcaster in the world. We followed this up with many shows that showcased a sunny Australian outlook with a zany, fantastical take on the world. Through comedy and adventure, we explore themes of friendship, family, feeling like a misfit, the little kid taking on the world, growing up, physical discomfort with our bodies, and first love. Producing children's drama, which was relatively well funded, turned out to be a very worthwhile public investment. Our quality children's drama is rerun many times over and entertains a fresh generation of children every few years. It's also used extensively in schools as an educational resource, and it travels globally, representing Australian artistic excellence on the world stage and offering children everywhere an insight into Australian culture and values. And now I would love to say that this is the end of the story and we all lived happily ever after. But that would be a big fat lie. As I said at the beginning, the commercial broadcasters never liked being made to screen Australian children's drama. They lobbied for many years, year in, year out, to have those regulations scrapped. When that didn't work, they tried putting the show on air at times when children couldn't see them, in the middle of the day when they were at school, or very early in the morning, for example. They didn't promote them very well. They put on half a series at 1 o'clock on Saturday afternoon, and then they would put the other half of the series on the next year at 1:30 in the afternoon. They tried to make sure that the programs failed. And additionally, the regulations did not apply to the ABC, our public broadcaster. The ABC argues that any regulations for them would amount to government interference and affect their independence as a public broadcaster, and that we should all just trust them with children's television. But for a long time, this meant that the ABC showed far more imported programs than local children's programs because it didn't spend much money on the children's audience. So the ACTF has spent as much time advocating for children's content as it has investing in and producing children's content. We lobbied government to give the ABC additional funding to establish its own digital children's channel, ABC Me. And the result is that for the last 15 years, the ABC has actually been the biggest broadcaster of children's programs. We lobbied to try and maintain the children's obligations on commercial broadcasters, but in 2020, we finally lost that battle as the children's audience has pretty much stopped watching commercial free-to-air television. Today, we're agitating for the international streaming services to have Australian content obligations, including obligations for children's content. And there's a meeting about that at Parliament House next month. We're also working closely with NITV, our national Indigenous television channel, to support the production of content made especially for First Nations children, which we hope all children will go on and enjoy. So the screen industry, here and everywhere, is in a permanent state of transition and disruption. The rise of the international streaming companies has brought increased competition to traditional free-to-air broadcasters. Old models of funding and regulation are being turned on their head, and children are watching content on all sorts of platforms, including TikTok and YouTube. But we know they are still consuming high-end drama too, but the way that they find that content is changing and audiences are fragmenting. The ACTF has to continue to evolve and respond to changing times, but there are fundamental aspects of our DNA that will never change. We don't underestimate the children's audience. We will always seek to delight, entertain and inform and challenge them with distinctive Australian stories so that all our nation's children can see themselves represented. Today we engage and partner with all the platforms where children seek out content, whether that's the ABC, NITV or any of the streaming platforms or commercial broadcasters. And really importantly, at an industry event like this, we work with Australia's best screen practitioners to deliver our vision. We're living in a great screen age where we all have so much choice, but children's content is the most vulnerable of any type of screen content because it's so expensive to produce high quality content that children love to watch. And it's difficult to finance because commissioning broadcasters and streaming platforms won't pay the same amount of money that they'll pay for adult content. So children's television, the way we do it, is not for the faint-hearted. And you might ask, why bother? Does it really matter as much now as it did 40 years ago when there is so much more choice? Well, I think it's more important now than ever before, because exactly as the Minister said earlier, today's children are inundated with screens. We're still learning about the impact of so many screens and what that impact on their formative years will be. How will short-form content and watching and playing multiple screens at once impact their concentration spans, their social skills and social cohesion? There's much to think about, but we must stay concerned with the quality of the content that children have access to on all those screens. Because as children grow, they're developing their sense of self, their identity, and their understanding of the world in relation to others. When children see their own lives reflected on the screen in ways which are relatable to their situation, they experience recognition and affirmation with characters and stories that help them imagine all the possibilities for someone like them. Likewise, when they see others who remind them of the children in their lives who might be different to them, they're encouraged to learn to love and appreciate the difference. In this way, children's screen content is both a mirror and a window in a child's life, with the capacity to influence in profound and positive ways. Children's television is contributing to broader social and national objectives as it communicates shared common values, respectful relationships and respect for all people. It's a leader in addressing diversity, inclusion and equality. It's proactive and progressive, assisting with strengthening multiculturalism, social inclusion, First Nations representation, countering racism and strengthening democracy. It enables children to feel seen and heard, consistent with our obligations under the United Nations Charter on the Rights of the Child to provide access to media which is linguistically and culturally relevant to them. That's why children's television deserves to be supported by government, by community, by public television and commercial television. It's why children's television needs strong advocacy. These are really challenging times to be a local television station, competing with the OTT platforms, streaming services and YouTube for the attention of the audience. And local content is an expensive option at a time when the audience is diminishing. But quality local content might be the key to retaining that audience because it distinguishes the local channel from the international service. To be successful, however, it needs to be properly funded so that it stands up against all of the other content that the audience is exposed to. And so it needs government support, it needs production incentives. And where there is that support for the screen industry, some of that support should be quarantined, especially for children's content. There will always be resistance to these concepts, so for children's television to be consistently produced over many years, it requires strong advocacy. For more than 40 years, Australia has been producing high-quality children's programs, and they have entertained audiences at home and around the world. It's been made possible through that combination of content regulation and government support on the basis that there is immense public value in screen content that speaks directly to Australian children and which reflects themes, culture, language and social values. This is a story that I hope you find helpful. When I was writing it, I wondered if you'd find it overwhelming. But it's so encouraging and exciting that you've organised these days to discuss these issues and that you already have your Minister for Culture, your Screen Agency, members of your legislature, all here to listen and consider these issues. It's a journey that requires you to find these advocates and champions within the industry and within government, and it appears that we are well on the way. And after that, I think we take it one step at a time. Each outstanding children's program that is made in Taiwan might seem like a little drop in the ocean of the dross of content that is out there, but it will be a drop with many ripples which will demonstrate the power of seeing yourself on screen. And once you start, you won't be able to stop. Thank you.